Hello, welcome to Jason the Old Millennial. My name is Jason, speaking to my basement in the great state of Kansas. And today's video, I am continuing my Beatles deep dive. Of course, if you know me, big Beatles fan. So I did a part one, and now I'm gonna do a part two. And there probably won't be able to finish it. I probably have to do part three because I just have so much knowledge, I guess, about the Beatles. So when I start talking about them, I start talking quite a bit, and do a deep dive of all my of these different bands I've been doing, and I go through the whole discography, talk about the highlights of their career and all that, and then do top 10. Well, I just did my top 10 favorite Beatles songs. In fact, I ranked every single Beatles song, and I have a playlist. If you look at my channel and you want to see my reviews or my rankings of all the Beatles songs, I have all the lists from 213 all the way to 1. And I did a live stream this last week. I did 10 through 1 on that. Anyway, so I wanted to, since I usually do a deep dive when I do a top 10 list, I thought it'd be fun to try to do a deep dive on the Beatles and see if I can do it without any notes. I usually write a bunch of notes and read off of that as I'm talking about the band. But so for this, it's kind of see if I can, get it somewhat accurate without having to look at any notes, because I just spent 30 years of my life listening to the Beatles, reading about them, watching documentaries. So yeah, definitely a band I know quite a bit about. So anyway, so going to part two. Part one, I started basically around 1956, ended in 1963. So I'm starting with 1964, basically with the Beatles. And 1964 is a very important year for the Beatles, one of the biggest years for them. Because at this point, the Beatles hadn't hit the American market yet. At this point, their Beatlemania, as I said last time, was definitely hitting all of Europe, and they were the biggest band. Interesting, they didn't really hit in America yet, and at that point, no British band or artist had really made it big in America. So it was kind of a risky thing, going to America and trying to make it there. And of course, you want to make it in America because America obviously is huge and it has it's definitely the entertainment capital of the world. It's definitely a place every band wants to be big at. If you want to get big, you want to come to America. That's where you get the big money probably, and everything else. That's where you get your popularity a lot of times. Like I said. Anyway, so when we get to 1964, they definitely were planning on coming to America at that point. Like I said, can't remember what I said in the last video, but Capitol Records, which had the rights to the Beatles music, Beatles had put up 2 albums in Great Britain at this point, which was Please Please Me and With the Beatles, and neither one came out in the United States. But Capitol Records didn't put anything out for the Beatles because the Beatles, like I said, it was just uncommon for British performances or performers to come to America, and so there's a smaller company kind of connected called VJ, and VJ, like I said, did more. I think they did more jazz and like R&B type stuff, and so, but they evidently, the guy that was in charge kind of saw something in the Beatles, and so asked Capitol Record if they could put out some Beatles stuff, and so they took some Beatles stuff and put it out there. That didn't catch on, I think, right away. If I remember right, I think they put some stuff out, but DJs weren't playing on the radio or anything. Until about 1964. I can't remember exactly when, but I'm guessing either late 1963, early 1964. Finally, the Beatles were starting to come over to America, and we're starting to hear about them, this big band over Great Britain. And then they started putting out some of their singles at the time. At this time, Beatles had like 4 or 5 #1 singles in England. So I mean, they already were just catching on fire, and both their albums were #1 albums. I mean, they were just skyrocketing, early on. They're early on in the career, but they're already just skyrocketing. Their popularity is just something no one's ever seen before. No one's ever seen crowds like the crowds that were gathering around the Beatles. No one's seen girls screaming and passing out in the concerts, And so yeah, so it sounds like She Loves Me and I Want to Hold Your Hand were kind of some of the early ones coming over, and they started catching on, of course. And I don't know exactly when, I didn't look it up, but we do know at least by February of 1964, I Want You to Hold Your Hand became the first #1 single in America. And then I think quickly after that, the number one started just kicking in, like She Loves You, and you know, songs like Twist and Shout were hitting really big, and probably From Me to You and all, and Please Please Me, yeah, all those songs. In fact, VJ put out a album called Introducing the Beatles, and that was the first album came out in the United States. But then, like a week later, Capitol kind of finally saw that, oh, the Beatles are starting to become huge. So Capitol Records, like a week later, put out their own first Beatles album, which I don't know if that was Meet the Beatles. I'm forgetting exactly, but they put out their first. I want to say it's Meet the Beatles might have been their first one, if I remember right. Anyway, so it kind of overshadowed Introducing the Beatles that VJ put out, and after that, Capitol started putting out, you know, records for the American market, of course, because they're coming huge. When they got to hit that number one single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Beatles were planning on coming to America to do their first concert, basically at Ed Sullivan's show, which was the biggest show, the biggest variety show in America, maybe all around the world. But I know in America, that was like what you did, I think, on Sunday nights, I want to say. Like, everybody, like, watched the Ed Sullivan show. And they had all kinds of, you know, not just bands and singers, but comedians and jugglers and everything, you know. And I know my dad said that that was the thing his family always, I think, got around and watched the Ed Sullivan show every, like, Sunday night or something, if I remember right. Anyway, so they were coming to that Sullivan show, but they wanted a number one hit before they came to America. So I Want to Hold Your Hand hit number one right before they came over here. So that was a really good thing for them. Of course, they didn't know how big they would be in America at that point. But when they came off the plane in February, I don't know if February 9th was the date of the Ed Sullivan show. So they came probably a couple of days before, if maybe 7th or something like that. And of course, there's this huge crowd just, you know, waiting for them. And they knew when they came off that plane, that's that famous picture of them walking down off the plane. And you see this huge crowd just screaming. And they knew, okay, we got pretty big here in America as well. So this should go pretty good. And so that performance at the Ed Sullivan show was the biggest performance like ever in America. I did record numbers as far as viewerships. Like, it was like 90% of everybody was like watching that Sullivan show that night. It did just absolutely huge numbers. And if you watch the footage, you can see the girls screaming in the audience. I mean, it's just a great, you know, one of the most monumental events in music history, television history, I would say. Anyway, so that really kicked off America. They even did some concerts around America, of course, and went to Washington, D.C. and did a famous big concert there. And then they went to Miami, in fact, and did another Ed Sullivan show there. Anyways, and they loved it in America, and that was like a big thing to them. And then going back to Europe, and then they were, at that point, yeah, absolutely huge, of course. And then they got approached to do a movie, just like Elvis, because Elvis was doing a bunch of movies. And so when they approached Beatles, it was, I guess, kind of the same idea. It's like, even though they're not actors, it's like, it doesn't matter. People go see them just because everybody wants to see the Beatles. So, you know, the movie's going to make money. As long as you have Beatles singing songs in it, yeah, it's just a guaranteed deal. And so they approached them about, you know, and I think they signed a 4-picture deal. Like, they were going to do 4 movies for the company that, I guess, that put out the deal. And yeah, so they agreed to do this movie, and they set it all up. Richard Lester directing it, and they're playing themselves, and the whole movie, of course, we know it as A Hard Day's Night, comes out in 1964, and it's about like the Beatles. They get on a train, they're going to a concert, and then it's about them rehearsing at the concert, and then other things happen during the movie. But it's definitely a very funny, silly movie, comedy, and has a lot of great music in it as well. Mostly some new material, and they even play some old material in as well. But at the time, they just wrote whatever. It was the first album that came out that was all Lennon and McCartney, because the first 2 albums had a lot of cover songs on it. So this is the first album that just all original. And so they come out with this Hard Day's Night, and it becomes a huge hit. It does really well, of course, in the theater, as you can, you know, imagine. The album, of course, is number 1, at least in UK, probably in the United States as well, even though they're slightly different. The United States had a second side that was all musical score of the movie, while in Great Britain you had the whole second side was other original songs from the Beatles. But yeah, huge, great album. They did very well, of course. So that was really big for them. Another #1 album, a huge hit movie. I mean, they're touring and just selling out everything, putting out #1 hits after #1 hits. I mean, Hard Day's Night was #1. I think Can't Buy Me Love was #1. At one point, they were the only band to ever do this, but they had in America they had the top 5 spots on the Billboard 100. I mean, never done by any band or artist in the history, and never will be. I wouldn't think. It's just insane that yeah, they had #1 through #5 on the list. I mean, which I believe was Can't Buy Me Love, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, um, Twist and Shout, and Please Please Me, I think were the 5 songs they had in the top 5 spots. So yeah, so they're just doing, I mean, here in 1964, it's still pretty early in their career. It really is becoming a big band, and they're just top of the world already at this point. So yeah, so then you get to 1965, and I'm trying to think. No, I guess they do another. Okay, they do another album in 1964. Beatles for Sale, I believe, came out late 1964, and or maybe it was early 1965. I can't. I'm forgetting, but people forget about that one because it came in between 2 huge ones, A Hard Day's Night and Help, and it was just because they were kind of contractually obligated, I guess, to put out 2 albums a year, which is insane because most bands now put 1 album per 2-3 years, maybe, you know, let alone an album a year. They're putting 2, and not just 2 albums, 2 #1 hit albums a year. I mean, their music was just skyrocketing, and they kept their big singles off the album. So not only were they putting out 2 all their albums were #1, and so every album they're putting out is a #1 hit album. And besides that, they're putting out like 2 singles, I think, or maybe they're putting out 4 singles a year as well, like 2 singles per album. And those singles aren't usually even on the album. So not only do you get these great songs on the album, but then you have usually 2 to 4 singles that are also huge hits. I mean, so they're just putting out so much. And a lot of it's Lynn McCartney. They wrote majority of the music. Harrison didn't start writing really till with the Beatles. He did get "Don't Bother Me" was his first single, but most everything else was cover songs that he was doing, like on "Hard Day's Night" and "Please Please Me." Anyway, so he was mostly doing covers. He was just starting to get into writing. Ringo never really got into writing; it wasn't really his thing. But it was obviously Lynn McCartney was the core of the group. I mean, that was really driving the group and why they were so popular. I mean, they are considered the greatest duo songwriters of all time. You know, if you go to, I went to England in 2015 and went to the library in London. I went to London, and there's a library there in London that you go to, and you get to see like all these famous works by great British artists. I mean, British writers. So you have, you know, like Chaucer, what's his name? You have like the Magna Carta. You have like these historical, you know, writings, and then you have Lynn McCartney stuff. So it's so cool. Like Lynn McCartney is the only musicians that have writings along with all these other historical writers. So that's how huge they are. I think in not just England, but the history of history. You know, they're just the biggest writers of all time. Anyway, so yeah, so they're putting out all these huge hits. Beatles for Sale is a little bit of a letdown because they had to go back to, because they're just being run ragged. I mean, they were putting out 2 albums, 4 singles, plus they were touring all over the place, America, Europe, England. You know, they were doing all this stuff, and they didn't have a lot of time to themselves. And so when they did the Beatles for Sale, they didn't have enough original material, so they had to go back to doing like 6 cover songs, 8 originals, and that's why it's considered probably the worst album that they did. Still a #1 hit album, of course, and still some great songs like No Reply, I'm a Loser, 8 Days a Week. I mean, I think some really good songs there. But then the cover songs aren't that good. But anyway, so that's what happened with that. So then we get to 1965, and we come out with another movie. This one called Help, of course, which John wrote the song called Help. That the first title of the movie is going to be 8 Arms to Hold You. Was the original title, but then they changed it to Help when John wrote the song, and it worked really well with the movie. And again, another just fantastic soundtrack that they write. And Help, another just the Beatles kind of playing themselves, but yet this was more adventurous. They were traveling to the Bahamas and to I think Switzerland or something like that. And it was kind of this adventure movie where this cult is after Ringo because he has a sacred ring on his hand, but he can't get it off, so they have to cut it off maybe or kill him, sacrifice him to their god or whatever. Very strange movie, and it's very silly, and it's really dumb. It's a really dumb movie. And the Beatles are really hamming it up. But the music is really good. It's not a good movie, but I do enjoy the music. And I mean, you get some enjoyment out of watching the Beatles just, being kind of silly at times. And at this point, also I should say, they started smoking marijuana. Um, a lot of that is thanks to Bob Dylan. They're starting to become really big Bob Dylan fans. And Bob Dylan's really a big influence on them at this point, as they're listening to a lot of his Bob Dylan stuff coming out. And they met Bob Dylan in a hotel room, and Bob Dylan, put out some marijuana and said, "Hey, you want to smoke some marijuana?" And not realizing the Beatles hadn't smoked it yet, and so they're like, "Yeah." So they smoked marijuana for the first time with Bob Dylan and enjoyed it quite a bit. And they were really well known for being big marijuana smokers at that point. In fact, that's what they wanted to do all the time, was smoke marijuana, which doesn't, from what I've heard, I never smoked marijuana. From what I heard, it hurts the your ability to concentrate or focus, or to, work real hard, on something like a movie. And so they weren't really good in the movie because they were smoking marijuana quite a bit. And so they were having hard times remembering their lines, or, concentrating enough to really do a scene. So you can kind of tell in that movie, I think they had to try to come up with other actors to take over scenes and not give the Beatles too much to do. But still, it's just still funness to it, I think. And again, the album, one of my favorite albums of all time, amazing album, and obviously a big hit. I mean, Help was, I think, a #1 hit, maybe at least in America. And then Yesterday, my favorite song. If you saw my top 10 favorite songs list, Yesterday was #1 on my list. That's my favorite Beatles song and my favorite song of all time. It's not in the movie, but it's on the album Help. And yeah, it's definitely Paul's maybe greatest song, well-known song that I did, along with Let It Be and Hey Jude. But definitely the first time he really did a song by himself. None of the Beatles are on it. It's just him and an acoustic guitar and orchestra. And at the time, it was kind of risky because they thought, "Oh, are people going to think Paul's trying to be a solo artist? Are the Beatles breaking up?" And of course, Brian Epstein had to go out there and go, "No, the Beatles are not breaking up," because he didn't want that to happen at all, because they're making tons of money at this time. So it's like, no, this is just a song that Paul's doing, because didn't think any of the Beatles could really add anything to it. So Paul's kind of doing it solo, but definitely was changing their sound a little bit with that. Like I said, I think they're very influenced by Bob Dylan, and you kind of tell on the album, it definitely has a more of a folk rock feel to it compared to the other 3 albums. You still had some really good rock songs like Help, and Another Girl, and I Just Seen a Face. But then you get these more like Yesterday, introspective songs like that, and You're Gonna Hide Your Love Away, or you got Ticket to Ride, another great rock song. But you've got Hide Your Love Away, feels like a really Bob Dylan-ish type song that John wrote, very introspective type, music, acoustic guitar, and they're starting to do a little more in the studio, adding some more instruments, like I said, orchestra and Yesterday, and they add clarinet or something too. You've got Hide Your Love Away. So definitely doing a little more in the studio. They're definitely, I think, maturing a little bit in their songwriting, and better sounds in their recordings, and mixing a lot more. And so definitely growing as a group at this point, 1965, which is really cool to see that they're not just going to stay the same, but they're going to evolve with the times, and evolve with the music around them, and let the music around them influence them as they influence everybody else at the same time. So very interesting time. I think, in my opinion, probably the best years of the Beatles is around 65 to 67. That's such an amazing period for them, as they're starting to change slightly from the earlier days, but still having that great Beatles sound, and great songwriting, and great harmonies as well. But anyways, and then later in 1965, they come out with another album, another one of their biggest ones, that is Rubber Soul, another favorite of mine. And again, Rubber Soul, I feel like they're starting to change their sound a little bit in the studio. The guitars sound a little heavier. There's this fuzzy bass sound in there. I think Paul's becoming a much better bass player at this time. and doing a lot more in that. I think the opener, Drive My Car, which people don't like, I really like that song, but it was definitely the hardest rock song they have done at that point. I think if you listen to that song, the bass is just killing it. It's got this fuzzy sound to it, as they call it. The guitar solos are really getting better. And this was a really nice rock song anyways. And the whole album it just feels like they're experimenting a little bit more. They're not quite getting to the psychedelic era, but they definitely were changing a little bit. Like I said, a little more introspective, retrospective type songs, reminiscing about the past, like In My Life, which was like my third favorite song on my top 10 favorite Beatles song list. It's such a great song John wrote about reminiscing about the past, thinking about the past and all this, and really beautiful song. I know their songs are just coming, just not straight out rock songs, but just some really beautiful music. I mean, you got Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man. I mean, man, just some of my favorite songs right there. And very, the writing is just, I don't know, just getting a little bit different, writing about other things and just love relationships. Nowhere Man, in fact, is the first song they wrote that really had nothing to do with relationships. It's just like this, I'm not sure what it's about. They're singing about a guy who's, not, doing much, I guess, in his life, and they call him the Nowhere Man. But Norwegian Wood's the first song that has the sitar in it, because George is starting to get into the Hinduism religion, and he's starting to dabble in the sitar. So they throw a sitar, which was the first time I think anybody ever did that in music. Anyway, so they're doing a lot of interesting things there. That was changing the music industry, I would say. But yeah, it's a really great album, full of a lot of interesting songs. The first song ever to win the Grammy for Song of the Year, Michelle, which is a song I don't like. It's one of my least favorite Beatles songs, but it's usually pretty popular amongst most people. It's kind of a French, there's some French in it, and it has like this French kind of sound to it. Anyways, but it won the Grammy Song of the Year, the only one the Beatles did, which is crazy how, how did Yesterday or Hey Jude or Let It Be not win Song of the Year? It's just crazy, but Michelle did. Of all of them, Michelle did. So that was a big thing for them at the time, 1965. But yeah, definitely their sound is starting to get a little mature, a little different. They're spending more time in the studio. They're also putting out obviously some other big singles. One of the big ones is I Feel Fine, which it's the first time they had feedback. The song begins with this John playing this note, and then he puts it close to the amp, and it does this feedback sound. And I believe that's the first time it's ever done in music. John kind of discovered that on accident and put it in the song. And then you hear it a lot. Of course, after that, that's a big deal, putting feedback. Jimi Hendrix, all about feedback, So that was kind of cool. Like I said, they're kind of inventing things. They're very, very innovative band. And just, doing things that no one else was doing at that time. And selling more records than anybody was selling at that time. And everything was #1 here and there. And they're just on top of the world and at this point. I'll go to 1966. I might have to end the video, and then I'll do part 3 at some point. But again, in 1966, they're, of course, doing a lot of touring still. They're getting a little tired of touring. They can't hear themselves because the crowds are screaming, so they can't really hear. They feel, I know Ringo said that he felt like his playing was getting worse. Like he was having a hard time keeping the drum beat, and he just felt like they weren't playing very good, and he felt like it was making the band worse playing live because these crowds are just screaming, and it felt like no one can hear them sing. So it's like, why are we even out here? Everybody's screaming, no one can hear us. I should say they did one of the biggest concerts of all time around this time. Either 65, I want to say probably around 65. They did the Shea Stadium, which was a record-breaking concert. They did it in this I think it's a baseball stadium or something like that. I forget exactly where that's at, but you probably heard Shea Stadium. It's one of the biggest stadiums to do concerts in. And they were the first ones to do it, I believe, in Shea Stadium, and just sold out the place, and just massive audience in there. No one could hear them very good, but because they're like on this middle of this baseball field, and everybody's like way back here, and the sound systems weren't that good. But that was a big deal at the time, anyways. But anyway, so but yeah, 1966, they were still doing some touring, but they really weren't liking it, and they had a really bad experience. They went to Japan that year. They went to some places they never been before, And Japan was fine. The Budokan was a good concert, but they went to the Philippines and they had a catastrophe there where they were ran out of the country because they, not to go into it, but they offended the leader on accident, or didn't mean to, but they offended the leader, and then they were like running for their lives basically, and had to fly out of there quickly. They're gonna get attacked. So after that, they're like, we're kind of done with doing tours and concerts, live concerts, which was a big deal at times. I mean, they're the biggest band in the world. How do you not go seeing live? That's a huge deal about being a band. Anyway, so their last concert was 1966, I believe, at Candlestick Park, and I believe that was in San Francisco. And yeah, they didn't announce it. They just but they kind of knew. It's like after they did the concert, they kind of looked at each other and was like, it's like, that's the last one. Like, we're not doing anymore. And then later it was announced that they basically weren't going to do concerts anymore, which is just, just kind of crazy at the time. But I think they wanted to spend more time in the studio making good music, because they knew if they were in the studio, they can do, they can throw more experimentation in there, and they can do stuff in the studio they can't do live, which they were kind of interested in. And they were inspired by, like, Brian Wilson was doing Pet Sounds, which was Brian Wilson was inspired by Rubber Soul to do Pet Sounds, and then Beatles were inspired by Pet Sounds to do Revolver, because Pet Sounds was just, the studio work was just so amazing, and the wall sound that he kind of created was just something that really hadn't been done before, or to that extent. And so the Beatles were kind of one of the top Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, in that sense. Anyway, so yeah, so that was a big time for them. Quit doing the concerts and all that, and just doing studio work. Well, my time's running out, so part 3, it might be 4 parts, because I can barely go 1 or 2 years talking about the Beatles before I run out of time. So we'll see how many parts this goes, but this will be the end of part 2. So thank you for watching and liking the video, and thank you to all the subscribers for supporting the channel. I appreciate you all, and I hope you have a good day.